When people ask how narcissists deal with remorse, guilt, and shame over the long term, they are usually asking a deeper question beneath the surface. They want to know whether narcissistic people ever truly feel the weight of what they have done. They want to know whether the pain they caused ever catches up to them. They want to know whether a person who seemed cold, defensive, self-justifying, or emotionally unreachable ever sits alone later in life and feels the full force of their choices. The short answer is yes, but not always in the clean, immediate, accountable way people imagine. In many cases, narcissists do not process remorse, guilt, and shame in a direct or healthy way when the harmful behavior happens. Instead, those emotions often get distorted, denied, redirected, or buried. In the moment, a narcissistic person may feel bad, may feel guilty, may even feel a flash of shame, but their mind often moves quickly to protect itself. That protection can look like blame shifting, rationalization, minimization, rewriting the story, or convincing themselves that the other person caused the reaction. It can feel real to them at the time. It can feel justified. It can feel necessary. Yet unprocessed emotional truth does not simply vanish because it is explained away. It often gets stored, displaced, and deferred. Then years later, sometimes decades later, it returns unexpectedly like a wave. This is one of the least discussed realities of narcissism. A lot of people think narcissists either feel nothing or feel everything and just do not care. The reality is usually more complicated. Many narcissistic people do feel things, but they do not feel them in a steady, integrated, emotionally honest way. Their inner world may be deeply defended. Their ego may be organized around protection from vulnerability, defectiveness, inferiority, rejection, humiliation, or emotional exposure. Because of that, emotions like guilt and shame do not always get processed in real time. They may be converted into anger. They may become contempt. They may turn into resentment. They may get projected onto someone else. They may become a private narrative where the narcissistic person becomes the misunderstood victim, the justified retaliator, the exhausted hero, or the person who had no choice. That story keeps the psyche stable in the moment. It helps them survive themselves. But survival and resolution are not the same thing. The story may carry them through the day, the argument, the breakup, the betrayal, the humiliation, or the fallout, but unresolved emotional material tends to remain alive under the surface. Over time, many narcissistic people experience what can be called delayed emotional rebound. That rebound does not always look like direct remorse. Sometimes it comes as intrusive memories. Sometimes it shows up as agitation without a clear cause. Sometimes it arrives as a sudden body-level feeling of disgust, dread, or collapse. Sometimes it takes the form of replaying an old interaction from 10 or 20 years ago and realizing, maybe for the first time, what they actually did to someone. Sometimes it is not even moral clarity at first. It is just a sharp emotional hit. They can be relaxing, watching television, driving, lying in bed, or sitting quietly, and suddenly a memory appears out of nowhere. Something cruel they said. Someone they manipulated. Someone they abandoned. A lie they told. A humiliation they caused. A relationship they destroyed. A person they blamed because they could not bear to face themselves. And in that moment the old defense does not fully work anymore. The mind can still try to explain it away, but the emotional charge has changed. What was once easy to justify now lands differently. The past comes back not as an abstract event but as an unfinished emotional debt. This matters because one of the biggest misunderstandings about narcissism is the idea that a narcissistic person's lack of accountability in the moment means there is no inner consequence later. For some people, the inner consequence is delayed, fragmented, and chaotic, but it is very real. The issue is that delayed remorse does not automatically become repair. Delayed guilt does not automatically become change. Delayed shame does not automatically produce empathy. A narcissistic person may suffer because of what comes back to them later and still not know how to metabolize it. They may feel haunted by their past without becoming accountable in the present. They may think about the harm they caused over and over and still remain emotionally defended with the people they hurt. They may become depressed, irritable, spiritually restless, self-loathing, hyper-reflective, or emotionally unstable without making meaningful amends. The return of guilt and shame is not the same thing as healing. In fact, if those emotions remain unmanaged and unsupported, they can trigger even more defensive behavior. To understand how narcissists deal with remorse and guilt over an extended period of time, it helps to understand the role of shame. Shame is often central. Guilt says, "I did something bad." Shame says, "I am bad." In healthy development, people can tolerate guilt without collapsing into total shame. They can admit harm, make repairs, and maintain a stable sense of self. But for many narcissistic people, especially those with significant defenses, guilt can feel dangerously close to annihilation. If admitting one harmful act feels like admitting they are fundamentally defective, worthless, weak, unlovable, or exposed, then the psyche may reflexively reject accountability. That is where the mental gymnastics begin. The mind searches for a narrative that reduces the shame threat. It says the other person deserved it. It says the other person was too sensitive. It says it was self-defense. It says everyone does bad things. It says the other person was manipulative first. It says nobody understands what the narcissistic person was going through. It says if they had not acted that way, they would have been hurt even more. These justifications may sound cold to outsiders, but internally they often function as emergency emotional regulation. This is why some narcissists can appear remorseful for a short period and then quickly become angry, dismissive, or even crueler. The initial guilt may have been real, but it triggered too much shame, and the shame triggered defense. In that sense, the narcissistic person is not necessarily lying when they seem briefly sorry and then later blame the other person. The emotional sequence may genuinely shift inside them. The problem is that their internal system is not built to hold contradiction well. "I hurt you and I am still worthy and intact" may not coexist easily inside them. So the guilt has to be redirected, denied, or evacuated. The easiest route is often to place responsibility somewhere else. That move reduces distress in the short term, but it also prevents integration. The unresolved event gets filed away with distortion. It is not healed. It is postponed. Postponed emotional truth has a way of returning. It may return during major life changes, aging, sobriety, grief, illness, loneliness, divorce, career failure, parenthood, spiritual crisis, or the loss of admiration and distraction. Many narcissistic people can outrun themselves when life is externally stimulating. Attention, success, conflict, seduction, status, work, image management, sexual acting out, substances, and fantasy can all function as forms of emotional anesthesia. As long as the inner world stays busy, shame can remain buried. But when the noise decreases, the self becomes harder to escape. The old memories begin to rise. The nervous system starts surfacing unfinished material. The psyche revisits what it once could not tolerate. This is why some people with narcissistic traits seem to become more reflective later in life. It is not always because they suddenly transformed morally. Sometimes it is because their usual distractions no longer work the same way. There is also a painful irony here. Many narcissistic people spend years blaming others to avoid the unbearable weight of shame, only to discover that the blame strategy does not erase the internal record. The mind may distort memory, but the body often keeps score. The nervous system remembers what the conscious story tries to skip. That is why a person can intellectually justify an old betrayal and still feel a sudden punch of dread when it comes back. The unresolved action remains emotionally encoded. It is not unlike a debt that has been deferred with interest. The cost compounds. What was not felt in the moment often becomes harder to feel later because it returns mixed with years of repetition, regret, identity damage, and missed chances to repair. Many people who have been hurt by narcissists want to know whether this means narcissists secretly suffer all the time. Not exactly. Some do. Some do intermittently. Some only have flashes. Some remain highly defended for most of their lives. Some become more reflective as they age. Some become more bitter. Some collapse into depression. Some swing between self-justification and self-condemnation. Some gain insight but never fully change. Some change meaningfully through therapy, recovery work, and deep repetition of accountability practices. Some never get there. There is no single emotional fate for all narcissistic people. But what can be said is that the absence of healthy remorse in the moment does not prove the absence of conscience altogether. In many cases, it proves the presence of a fragile internal structure that cannot tolerate immediate moral exposure. That is different from innocence. It is also different from emotional emptiness. When remorse returns years later, it often does so in fragments. A narcissistic person may not sit down and think, "I was emotionally abusive to that person, and I need to fully own it." More often the process begins with discomfort. They may feel restless after remembering an old argument. They may feel angry for no apparent reason. They may replay something at night and feel their stomach drop. They may remember a former partner crying and suddenly feel disgusted with themselves. They may see their own child react to them in a way that mirrors what someone once felt around them. They may experience a role reversal where they are now treated in the way they once treated others. They may lose someone important and feel old regrets flood in because loss breaks open compartments in the mind. This is how delayed guilt often works. It is not a neat moral awakening. It is an unwanted return of reality. The defensive mind does not give up easily, though. Even after the memory returns, the narcissistic person may still begin bargaining with it. They may say it was not that bad. They may say the other person hurt them too. They may say they were young. They may say nobody was innocent. They may compare themselves to worse people. They may turn the entire reflection into a self-focused tragedy where the main emotion becomes, "I cannot believe I have to feel this," rather than, "I cannot believe I did that to someone." This distinction matters. Narcissistic shame often remains self-referential. The person may feel terrible, but the center of gravity is still the self. The pain is not yet organized around the injured other person. It is organized around the narcissistic person's own discomfort, identity collapse, loss of control, or horror at having a flawed self-image. That means remorse can be present but still immature. Mature remorse involves recognition of impact, responsibility without excessive self-dramatization, empathy for the harmed person, and a willingness to repair where possible. Immature remorse may look like tears, regret, self-hatred, rumination, apology-seeking, or emotional collapse, but it still revolves around the narcissistic person's need to feel relieved. They may want forgiveness because they cannot bear the shame. They may reopen old wounds for the other person just to reduce their own guilt. They may confess in a way that is emotionally manipulative. They may make amends that are really bids for re-entry, admiration, absolution, or emotional soothing. In that sense, late guilt does not automatically mean late maturity. A narcissistic person may be suffering from what they did without yet becoming someone safe. At the same time, it would be inaccurate to say that delayed guilt is meaningless. It can be the beginning of change if the person is willing to stay with it rather than escape it. This is one of the hardest tasks for a narcissistic person. To sit in remorse without converting it into blame. To feel shame without becoming either grandiose or self-annihilating. To acknowledge wrongdoing without demanding immediate forgiveness. To let the harmed person's reality remain true even when it damages their preferred self-image. To stop performing insight and start practicing humility. That is difficult psychological work. It is not glamorous. It is repetitive. It often requires therapy, accountability structures, nervous system regulation, and a willingness to lose old identities. But it is possible. One reason this process is so difficult is because narcissistic defenses were not invented out of nowhere. They usually developed for a reason. In many cases, narcissistic patterns are rooted in environments where vulnerability was unsafe, love was conditional, shame was overwhelming, emotional needs were ignored, or worth was tied to performance, image, control, or superiority. That does not excuse harm. It helps explain why the psyche became so dependent on self-protection. If a person learned very early that being wrong meant being humiliated, rejected, swallowed, or emotionally annihilated, then admitting fault later in life can trigger ancient terror. The adult may look arrogant, but internally they may be fighting a much older fear: if I am truly seen, I will not survive it. That is why some narcissists attack when they are confronted. It is not just pride. It is a survival reflex wrapped in ego. Because of that, guilt and shame often accumulate in strange ways. The narcissistic person may have dozens or hundreds of unresolved moments stored over the years, each one defended against at the time, each one still alive somewhere below awareness. These unresolved experiences can create chronic inner tension. The person may become more irritable, more cynical, more emotionally exhausted, or more desperate for external validation without realizing how much buried shame is fueling the need. They may chase admiration harder because quiet feels dangerous. They may sabotage intimacy because closeness increases the chance of being seen. They may keep creating fresh conflict because conflict is easier to regulate than remorse. In other words, the long-term burden of unprocessed guilt can shape personality expression even when it is not consciously recognized. Some narcissistic people describe the experience almost like being haunted by themselves. They may be fine for weeks and then suddenly remember something cruel they did years ago. They may feel a flash of recognition so sharp that it cuts through their defenses. For a moment, they are not the hero, not the victim, not the justified reactor, not the superior one. For a moment, they are simply the person who caused pain. That moment can be profoundly destabilizing. Some people respond by numbing out again. Some dive into distraction. Some seek out validation. Some use substances. Some become angry. Some contact the person they hurt in ways that are more about discharging their own discomfort than offering real accountability. Some finally enter therapy with seriousness. The outcome depends on whether the person can stay emotionally present without fleeing back into the old false relief of blame. An important truth here is that blame works fast but fails slowly. It gives immediate relief. It organizes confusion. It protects self-esteem. It allows forward motion. But over years, it corrodes the inner life. It prevents learning. It damages relationships. It traps the person in repetition. And eventually it starts to break down because reality keeps sending evidence that the problem is not always everyone else. People leave. Trust disappears. Reputation cracks. Intimacy fails. Children grow up and speak honestly. Friends drift away. The same dynamics repeat in different settings. The narcissistic person may keep telling themselves each relationship ended because the other person was impossible, but repetition itself becomes a mirror. And when the mirror can no longer be ignored, shame returns with force. This does not mean every narcissistic person reaches a moral breakthrough. Some double down permanently. Some become more rigid with age, not less. Some turn shame into chronic grievance and decide the world is full of ungrateful, disappointing people. Some cloak themselves in spiritual language, therapeutic jargon, or pseudo-insight while never doing the hard work of repair. Some perform vulnerability to regain supply. Some become addicted to talking about their wounds while avoiding discussion of the wounds they caused. This is why loved ones must be careful not to confuse emotional pain with transformation. A narcissistic person feeling bad is not the same as a narcissistic person becoming accountable. Distress can coexist with manipulation. Tears can coexist with self-centeredness. Insight language can coexist with unchanged behavior. Still, people can and do change. But real change requires something narcissism resists: sustained contact with the truth. Not dramatic truth. Not self-punishing theatrical truth. Just ordinary, grounded, specific truth. I lied. I used people. I punished vulnerability. I blamed others for feelings I would not face. I made people carry the shame I could not tolerate. I confused power with safety. I sought control instead of connection. I wanted understanding without offering it. I demanded empathy while withholding it. I distorted events to protect my image. I hurt people and called it self-protection. These statements are not identity death. They are the beginning of integration. But to a highly defended narcissistic mind, they can feel like collapse. That is why progress is often slow and uneven. When remorse appears years later, one of the greatest challenges is distinguishing between shame and accountability. Shame says, I am disgusting and irredeemable. Accountability says, I caused harm, and I am responsible for addressing it. Shame tends to create collapse, secrecy, and self-obsession. Accountability creates action, honesty, and repair. Narcissistic people often get stuck in shame spirals because shame feels familiar and strangely self-centered. Even self-hatred can maintain a form of ego centrality. The person remains the main character, just in a tragic way instead of a grandiose one. Accountability asks them to move attention outward to impact, not merely inward to pain. That is why therapy for narcissistic traits must help build the capacity to tolerate guilt without falling into shame-based self-destruction or defensive counterattack. Another reason old guilt returns later is because emotional development can lag behind intellectual sophistication. Many narcissistic people are highly capable of analysis, storytelling, persuasion, and rationalization. They can explain events in ways that sound coherent and convincing. But emotional integration is different from narrative skill. A person can tell a polished story about why something happened and still have an unresolved moral wound beneath the story. They can understand psychology, attachment, trauma, and boundaries and still remain defended against their own impact. The return of old shame often reveals where intellectualization has replaced emotional digestion. When the memory hits, all the explanations in the world may not protect them from the raw recognition underneath. People who have been harmed by narcissists often want this reality acknowledged because they were made to feel crazy when the harm occurred. They may have been told they were the cause, the problem, the unstable one, the abusive one, the one who forced the reaction. They may have internalized that story for years. So hearing that the narcissistic person may later be confronted by their own buried guilt can feel validating. But there is a caution here. Victims should not build healing around the fantasy that the narcissist will eventually fully understand and suffer in exactly the right way. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes it does not. Sometimes it happens privately and never becomes repair. Sometimes it comes too late. Sometimes the person who caused harm gains partial insight but not enough courage to make amends. Closure cannot depend on another person's moral awakening. Still, it can be useful to know that denial is not always peace. Many narcissistic people are not escaping the consequences as cleanly as they appear from the outside. In fact, some narcissistic people live with a chronic undercurrent of unease that they barely understand. They may feel empty after achievements. They may feel restless in quiet moments. They may fear aging because aging reduces access to the admiration and control that once helped them regulate shame. They may experience existential panic as they lose beauty, status, influence, or sexual leverage. Suddenly the older emotional material has more room to surface. The self they built begins to weaken. They may look back over relationships and realize how many were transactional, coercive, avoidant, or exploitative. Regret can become intense at that stage, especially if they recognize they traded genuine intimacy for dominance or image. There can be grief not only for the people they hurt but for the self they never became. That grief is important. True remorse is not only about feeling bad for specific actions. It also involves mourning the false self. Many narcissistic people built identities around not needing, not depending, not apologizing, not softening, not losing. Those identities may have protected them, but they also cost them love, stability, trust, and inner peace. When insight deepens, there can be grief for all the years spent defending a self that was never truly secure. There can be sorrow over how many relationships were managed rather than experienced. There can be grief over the moments when tenderness was available but rejected because it felt too vulnerable. There can be pain over becoming the kind of person they once feared or resented. This kind of grief can be transformative if it is tolerated, but it can also trigger renewed defense if it becomes overwhelming. A key question is whether narcissists remember what they did. Sometimes yes, vividly. Sometimes they remember selectively. Sometimes they truly forget certain details because defensive memory processes are real. Sometimes they remember facts but not impact. Sometimes they remember impact only when something in the present unlocks it. Sometimes their memory returns in emotional fragments before cognitive clarity. The human mind is complicated, and narcissism complicates it further. What matters is not whether the person had a perfect record of every harmful act in conscious awareness. What matters is whether they are willing, when confronted with reality, to stop protecting themselves at the expense of truth. Delayed remorse becomes meaningful only when it leads to responsibility. Responsibility may include apology, but apology alone is not enough. A real apology from a narcissistic person has to be specific, non-defensive, impact-aware, and free of hidden demands. It cannot be, "I am sorry you felt that way." It cannot be, "I am sorry, but you also did things." It cannot be, "I was struggling, so you should understand." It cannot be an attempt to reopen access to someone who is safer without them. It must sound more like this: "I lied. I manipulated the situation. I blamed you instead of facing what I had done. I can see how damaging that was. You did not deserve it. I am not asking you to take care of my guilt. I just wanted to acknowledge the truth." That kind of apology requires enormous ego surrender. Many narcissistic people are not ready for it. Those who are often have done substantial inner work. The extended experience of guilt and shame in narcissism is often cyclical. First there is a harmful act. Then there is a flicker of discomfort. Then a defensive explanation. Then emotional relief. Then distance. Then repetition. Later a memory returns. Then distress. Then either deeper defense or deeper reflection. If the person chooses defense, the cycle continues. If the person chooses reflection, a new path becomes possible. That path usually involves learning to identify triggers, tolerate vulnerability, regulate shame, recognize projection, and separate being flawed from being annihilated. It also requires learning empathy not as performance but as sustained attention to another person's reality. For some narcissistic individuals, especially those who are self-aware and motivated, this work can fundamentally alter how they live. For others, the insight remains intermittent and painful but never fully integrated. One of the most difficult emotional experiences for a narcissistic person is recognizing that some damage cannot be undone. This is where genuine remorse becomes especially painful. It is one thing to feel guilty in the abstract. It is another to understand that someone's trust, innocence, peace, or years of life were affected by your behavior and cannot simply be restored. Narcissistic defenses often prefer quick repair, symbolic gestures, or rewriting the narrative because the full reality of irreversible harm is hard to bear. Yet maturity requires bearing it. Not theatrically. Not as self-torture. Just honestly. Some people will never want contact again. Some will never forgive. Some wounds remain. Accepting that without rage, self-pity, or retaliatory blame is a major developmental achievement. Another overlooked aspect is that some narcissistic people feel more remorse when they finally experience the same kind of harm themselves. This does not always come from pure empathy at first. Sometimes it starts as identification through pain. They are betrayed, discarded, humiliated, ignored, manipulated, or scapegoated, and suddenly an old memory lights up. This is what that person felt around me. That realization can be unsettling and even redemptive if it leads to true empathy. But it can also remain self-focused if the lesson is only, now I know how bad this feels to me. The bridge from self-experience to other awareness is crucial. Without it, suffering may increase but wisdom may not. For loved ones, partners, family members, and survivors, this topic can stir conflicting emotions. On one hand, it may feel satisfying to imagine the narcissist eventually haunted by what they did. On the other hand, it may feel painful to realize that even if the narcissist does suffer later, that suffering may never reach you as repair. Both realities can coexist. Yes, the internal consequences of narcissistic behavior may accumulate. Yes, old guilt may come back. Yes, shame may return in powerful waves. But no, that does not guarantee justice in the interpersonal sense. It does not guarantee accountability, apology, restitution, or relational safety. Healing for the harmed person still has to be built on boundaries, truth, support, and self-reclamation, not on the future conscience of the person who hurt them. For narcissistic individuals who are genuinely trying to change, the return of old guilt can actually become a turning point. Instead of treating those memories as punishment, they can begin treating them as invitations to integration. A memory surfaces. Instead of blaming the other person again, they stay present. They name what they did. They notice the urge to escape. They feel the shame in the body without making it someone else's problem. They ask what repair is possible and what repair is no longer possible. They practice grief instead of self-justification. They learn that accountability does not kill them. Over time, this can change the relationship to remorse. It stops being a random haunting and becomes part of a conscious ethical life. That process also involves giving up the fantasy of being the good person automatically. Many narcissistic people, like many humans, want to believe they are fundamentally good and therefore whatever they did must have been understandable enough to preserve that image. But moral growth often begins when a person stops protecting goodness as an identity and starts practicing goodness as behavior. A narcissistic person may never feel completely comfortable with that shift because image has long functioned as emotional protection. Yet that discomfort is exactly where growth happens. Real self-respect does not come from being flawless. It comes from being honest enough to face flaws without deception. In long-term therapy, one of the most significant changes is often the development of reflective pause. Instead of instantly converting shame into blame, the person learns to pause. They notice the defensiveness rising. They hear the old inner narrative beginning to recruit evidence against the other person. They recognize the familiar move toward justification. And for the first time they do not fully obey it. That pause creates room for guilt to become informative instead of intolerable. It creates room for empathy to emerge before projection takes over. It creates room for humility, which is the opposite of the narcissistic emergency response. Over time, repeated pauses build a new inner structure. The person becomes less haunted because they are no longer spending their life outrunning themselves. Still, not every memory that returns later is useful. Some narcissistic people can become obsessive about their past in a way that is still self-centered. They may ruminate endlessly without changing behavior. They may use shame as proof of depth. They may become dramatic about their regrets in ways that burden others. They may publicize their remorse to appear evolved. This is why inner pain must be paired with external responsibility. Otherwise, guilt becomes another identity accessory. The question is not only, do narcissists feel bad later? The more important question is, what do they do with the bad feeling? Do they turn it into truth, repair, and behavioral change, or do they turn it into another self-focused cycle? From a psychological perspective, guilt can be adaptive when it leads to responsibility, while shame becomes corrosive when it leads to concealment and self-protection. Narcissistic individuals often need help learning the difference. They need to discover that guilt is survivable and that accountability does not equal obliteration. They need to understand that empathy is not submission, apology is not humiliation, and being wrong is not the same as being worthless. These lessons sound simple but can be revolutionary for a person whose entire internal architecture was built around defending against defectiveness. This is why recovery from narcissistic patterns is not just about behavior modification. It is about restructuring the relationship to vulnerability itself. Over an extended period of time, unresolved guilt and shame can also influence physical and mental health. Chronic stress, insomnia, agitation, depression, compulsive behavior, emotional numbing, sudden anger, addictive patterns, and relational instability can all be worsened by a psyche that is constantly managing buried moral pain. Not every symptom is caused by guilt, of course, but unresolved shame is exhausting. It requires ongoing energy to maintain the protective story, avoid stillness, monitor image, and suppress contradiction. As people age, that energy can become harder to sustain. The mind and body begin demanding a more truthful accounting. This is one reason some narcissistic individuals become more introspective later in life, even if that introspection is painful. What makes the whole subject so emotionally complex is that narcissistic remorse is often both real and limited at the same time. Real, because the person may genuinely feel crushed by a memory. Limited, because the feeling may still be filtered through self-concern. Real, because they may finally see the damage. Limited, because they may still want relief more than repair. Real, because they may mourn what they did. Limited, because they may still resist full accountability. These mixed states can be confusing for everyone involved. They can lead outsiders to overestimate change or dismiss sincerity too quickly. The better approach is to look at patterns. Does the person sustain truth over time? Do they stop blaming? Do they honor boundaries? Do they accept consequences? Do they act differently when no one is praising them? That is where actual transformation becomes visible. If a narcissistic person says that old memories of harm return years later and hit them like a wave, that experience should not be mocked or romanticized. It is a psychologically significant moment. It means that the old defense did not fully eliminate the moral reality. Something remains alive. The person is being confronted by parts of themselves they once disowned. That can be the beginning of honesty. But it must be handled carefully. The goal is not to drown in shame or seek instant absolution. The goal is to let the returning memory complete its message. This happened, you did it, it mattered, and blaming someone else did not resolve it. From there, the person can ask the only questions that truly matter now. What truth have I been avoiding? What repair is possible? How do I stop repeating this? What kind of person do I practice becoming from here? For many people who do not have narcissistic traits, remorse is unpleasant but straightforward enough to process. They feel bad, apologize, learn, and move on. For narcissistic people, remorse can be delayed because it threatens the structure that holds their self-image together. That delay is costly. It creates emotional debt. And emotional debt tends to return with interest. The more years that pass, the more painful the recognition can become because it is now layered with repetition and lost time. The person is not just facing one act. They are facing a pattern, a history, maybe an entire way of being. That can feel unbearable, which is why some go back to denial. But for those who do not, that same unbearable truth can become the doorway to a different life. In the end, how narcissists deal with remorse, guilt, and shame over an extended period of time depends on whether they keep using defense as their main form of regulation or whether they begin building the capacity for truth. In the short term, many narcissistic people avoid guilt by blaming others. They rationalize their behavior, minimize their harm, or recast themselves as the injured party. That strategy works just enough to keep functioning. But unprocessed guilt does not disappear. Years later it may return suddenly, vividly, and painfully. A memory rises. The old story weakens. The person feels what they once escaped. That moment can become another round of self-protection, or it can become the beginning of conscience in a more mature form. The hidden reality is that some narcissists are not free from remorse at all. They are delayed by it, distorted by it, ambushed by it, and frightened by what it means. They may carry old harm in fragments until life becomes quiet enough, lonely enough, painful enough, or honest enough for those fragments to surface. And when they do, the person has a choice. They can blame again, bury again, perform again, or finally face what they did without asking someone else to carry the emotional cost. That is the fork in the road. Not whether they feel something, but whether they can stay with what they feel long enough to let it become accountability instead of another defense. That is where remorse stops being a haunting and starts becoming a path toward real change.